Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you this morning about disclosure. I know we've talked about disclosure before, but it's something that's come up between myself and my agents in the last week 2 or 3 times, and I thought it was worth taking a look at. I received a phone call from one of the salespeople this week, and they said, I got a call, I'm going to be listing a property, and it is owned by my relative, by my sister-in-law. Do I need to disclose that? And I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. I'm going to say, my own personal feeling is no, but legally, as far as RICO is concerned, yes. And as they say, you don't have enough money to make their life as miserable as they can make yours for free, so you need to do what RICO says. But I want to give you a little bit of background of why I'm saying what I'm saying. It goes way back, probably 30 years ago, to the time that real estate was governed by a principle of sub-agency. And the philosophy was that you might be working with a buyer, you might go out with them for lunch, know their family, spend time together, understand their finances, been in their home, know what they're looking for, and ultimately you're going to bring an offer in on a cooperating broker's listing. You've never met the seller, but they said under sub-agency, you owe your loyalty to the seller, not your buyer. It was a ridiculous philosophy, but that was what was governing the real estate industry. And the philosophy was it followed the money, and since the seller was paying the commission, you owed your loyalty to the seller. So if you are bringing in an offer with a buyer you know, buyer you've worked with, buyer you like, and yet your loyalty's with a seller, what happens if, compounding the problem, that buyer is a relative? Well, they say that there's a chance to tip the scale a little bit. You might be a little bit more leaning toward the best interest of your buyer, and so you absolutely have to disclose that. Well, we're not under sub-agency any longer. You are representing your client. You have an obligation to look after the best interests of your clients. How can it be better than the best interests? So I think the necessity for disclosure in those kind of circumstances is no longer there. But RICO hasn't changed the philosophy yet, and so it's important. The answer is yes, you need to disclose. Well, the agent went on and said to me, there's another problem, and that is that the house was substantially damaged by fire. The insurance came along and rectified the problem. Is that something that I need to disclose? The answer to that one is yes. And it really brings down the question of stigma. And I want you to think about urea formaldehyde for a minute. We don't run across it as much as we used to, but there was a period of time when it was a very hot issue. And if people, for example, you may have had a client who put urea formaldehyde in his house, found out that it was deemed to be a health issue, removed the urea formaldehyde, and he was obligated to tell people that it once had urea formaldehyde and had been removed. And the homeowners would say, well, why would I have to stigmatize my house when it's been rectified? Went to the courts, and the court said, no, a buyer has a right to know that that happened in the house. It was put in and then it was taken out again. We had a situation one time. We had a listing west side of St. Catharines, fairly new home, nice area, and it was sold a firm. And from the time it was sold until closing, the new buyer walked past the house to admire the neighborhood and to look at the new house he was buying. Well, a neighbor came tearing out of his house, crossed the street, and said, you're the guy who's buying this house? Yeah, that's the house that was hit by lightning. Well, the buyer wasn't thrilled to hear about that. He felt like he'd been hoodwinked. So he called his agent. His agent called the listing agent. The listing agent knew nothing about it. The listing agent contacted the seller and said, yeah, it was hit by lightning, but the insurance looked after it. They replaced everything, anything that was damaged whatsoever. You could take this thing apart like a Lego set. You could take every joist, you could take every 2x4. There's nothing scorched, nothing damaged, the siding, nothing. And so I didn't think there was anything to say. Well, the buyer decided he didn't want to go through with the purchase because he felt like he'd been taken advantage of by not being told, and the courts ruled in his favor. He walked away from a firm deal and got his deposit back. So the fact that it had a fire, there's an obligation to disclose there. I want to say one thing, though, about handling disclosure for a minute. I wouldn't put in a listing, please be aware this house was damaged by fire and has been repaired. I wouldn't say that. What I would say was, please contact the listing agent before preparing an offer. I'm going to wait until the person sees the property. I'm not going to scare them away before they look at it. And once they've seen it, they decide they love it and they want to buy it, then I'm going to say to them, oh, by the way, I want to make sure they know. You work on the assumption that they're always going to know after the fact, and nobody likes a surprise. So if they're going to find out later, better they find out before and make an informed decision. So that's how I feel about that one. So then I get another phone call, and here's a sale, and the property is sold firm. We have the listing, and the listing agent sees a sign posted all of a sudden across the street, and it's announcing that the city is taking a look at an application for a zoning change to permit high-density construction of residential building across the street. He says, is that something that I need to disclose? Well, that comes down to this question about latent defect and material fact. A latent defect is something that's hidden, and if you know about it, you need to disclose it. Well, you could say, well, nobody knew anything about it until after the deal was firm and before closing. Well, that still could be communicated to the person if it's deemed to be a latent defect. I personally don't think it is. I think it's a material fact. A material fact is anything that would influence a buyer or seller's decision to buy or sell and at what price. And so it may influence the person's decision and at what price. I think it's incumbent on the agent representing the buyer to discover that and tell the buyer, and the buyer perhaps can get out of the deal if he wants to after it's firm. I don't know on that. But I did say to the agent, one thing I would advise you to do is have a discussion with your seller. You don't want to make this decision on your own and then have the buyer suddenly get cold feet because of this, and the seller's made his plans accordingly. Bring him in on the decision about whether or not you disclose it. But personally, I don't think you would need to. I believe it's a material fact. One last thing on disclosure, and that's when you are a participant. When you not only have a relative or have a friend or somebody could influence you, but you are going to be acquiring or disposing of an interest in real estate. Let me share a situation that happened with us that shed some light on this. Had an agent who purchased a house because the seller was being transferred to the U.S. They lived in the house, enjoyed the house. A couple of years later, there's a knock on the door, and it's the people they bought the house from. They said, we're being transferred back here in the area again. We'd like to buy our house back. Well, husband and wife, one being the agent, thought about it, discussed it, and said, yeah, we'll sell it to them. So they sold the house privately to the couple who used to own it. I knew nothing about it. It was done privately, and I didn't have a problem with that. Somehow, in one of our RICO audits, RICO came in and got wind of this. I don't know how they did, but they took exception to it. They said, there needs to be a file in your office. I said, why? It's a private deal. Didn't know anything about it. They said, how can we establish that they made disclosure if there isn't a file? So even though it's a private deal, they say, if you're a real estate agent and you're involved in the transaction, we are very, very concerned that you give disclosure. So various situations, various factors, but disclosure is a very important thing you need to be aware of. Thank you very much for joining this video. I'll talk to you again next week.